Evening. My name is Kate Elliott and I am a Library Development Officer. I'm joined by my colleague Dorata Loku, and we're part of the team who organised the seasonal event programme for Brent Libraries. So tonight's event is part of our Black History Month programming. And those of you who are very familiar with our programme know that Brent Libraries Arts and Heritage celebrate diversity throughout the whole year and not only during the month of October. And of course, today is Remembrance Day, and so this event is very timely for us. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome back Stephen Bourne this evening. Stephen is a writer, film and social historian who specialises in Black heritage and gay culture. Stephen has written about gay men's lives, and titles include Playing Gay in the Golden Age of British TV. The writer, Russell T. Davies, whose works include Doctor Who and It's a Sin, describes this book as a masterpiece. Stephen's most recent radio and TV appearances have included BBC Radio 4's Front Row and Last Word, and BBC One's The One Show Black History Month special in October 2020. Now, Stephen's best known book is Black Poppies, British Black Community and the Great War. This was first published in 2014 to coincide with the centenary of World War I. In 2019, a new edition was published, and in October that year, the Booker Prize winner, Bernardine Evaristo, voted Stephen her Black History Month hero on Facebook. This evening, you are also going to hear about Stephen's brand new book, On the Route, Trailblazers Who Changed British Theatre. So over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's been a while since I gave a talk in Brent Libraries. I think it was Willesden Library was the last one some years ago. But it's great to be back, even though I'm online and not in person. There's a lot of ground to cover. I can't really talk very much about my books other than Black Poppies, because it's Remembrance Day today, the 11th of November. I thought I'd concentrate on that. But before I do, I will just briefly give you an outline of where I'm coming from. Last month, October the 14th to be exact, I celebrated 30 years of writing Black British history books. It's been a long, difficult journey. Mostly the books were published against the odds. Mostly publishers in this country declined to publish them. But the way I got into writing Black British history books was very much 1991. This book was published called Aunt Esther's Story. Now, Esther was my adopted aunt, and she was a Black Londoner, born just before the First World War, born in Fulham in 1912. And she was adopted into my white working class family in 1941 when she was a young woman. Her Guyanese father, who raised her as a single parent in the Fulham community where my family lived, was killed in an accident in the London Blitz in 1941. So my great-grandmother, who was a white working class matriarch, she was a mother figure in that community. She'd known Esther all of Esther's life, and Granny just simply said to her, come and live with us. You know, you've got no family in this country. We can share our rations. We're going to the air raid shelter together anyway. And it was as simple as that. It was wartime. Esther was alone, but she wasn't, because she had this working class community around her. I say predominantly white. There were some other Black people living in her street, Dieppe Street in Fulham at the time, but not many. There were not that many Black Londoners around that she would have known in her community, but there were obviously Black communities across the country. So when I was at school in the 1970s, I went to a secondary modern school in South London. I was born in South London and hated it. I mean, I left at school at 16, as we all did, with no qualifications, never studied history, never went to university. There was no opportunity to go to university because that's what happened to working class kids who went to secondary moderns in those days. And so I used to, when I was at school, I used to abscond and go and visit the older relatives in Fulham. Although I grew up in Peckham in South London, the older relatives like Aunt Esther were in Fulham. And I used to talk to them about their lives. And it was much later, I'm jumping ahead, but I had the opportunity to do this book with Aunt Esther. And it's very important because I had to teach myself all those years how to research, how to write, how to be the person I am today, really. That was the foundation in the 1980s. In 1991, I discovered that Fulham and Hammersmith had funding for an ethnic communities oral history project. And they'd already published booklets like these, pamphlet type books, but very high quality books about the local Polish community, the travellers, the Irish community, the African Caribbean community in Fulham and Hammersmith. These are the days when funding for such projects was available, and that's how I got in. And they readily commissioned the Aunt Esther book in 1991, as long as she told her own story in her own words, and I edited it and frameworked it and contextualized it. And so I learned a very important lesson from that experience, that first-hand testimony is vital for the work that I do. If you can find the people that created the history and interview them and talk to them about their lives, which I've done many, many times with Black elders, if you like, over the last 30 years, there's rich history there. And I try to encourage younger people to do this, not just in their own families, but in their own communities. And so that's how the first book was published. And that set me on the road to writing many Black British history books, the latest being, which was published last month. So last month, October, was a very big month for me, the 30th anniversary, and the publication of Deep Are the Roots, Trailblazers Who Changed Black British Theatre. But this covers 150 years of Black British theatre. But it only goes up to 1975. So it starts in 1825 with Ira Aldridge, the Black Shakespearean from the Victorian era, and ends with some of the early Black theatre companies being established in the early 70s. And I hope, well, I know that Brent Libraries will have copies. If you can't buy it, then by all means borrow it from your local libraries. Support your local libraries. That's what I always say to people. And then in between, some of the highlights have been, as Kate mentioned, Fighting Proud, Gay Men's Lives in the Two World Wars, which was published in 2017. And also more recently, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, 1939 to 45, again, full of first-hand testimonies from Black servicemen, Black servicewomen, people on the home front. And that's how I approach my work. And as Kate said, the book that I'm best known for is Black Poppies. This is a copy of the first edition that was published in 2014 for the centenary of World War I. There had been many knockbacks before I started to write more regularly. Certainly Deep Are the Roots, just to give you an example, was rejected by 11 publishers back in 2010, 11 years ago. And I just gave up. I gave up on it until last year when my publisher, the History Press, my editor at the History Press said, have you got any ideas? And I said, well, there is this book called Deep Are the Roots that I desperately wanted to get published, but 11 publishers turned it down. He commissioned it. So if you have staying power, like I have, and you're bloody minded, like I am, you can make progress. So Black Poppies was a book that I wanted to do for the centenary, but I said to the History Press at the time, this was 2014, I don't just want to focus on the Black servicemen in the First World War. in Britain. I want to focus on the Black community in Britain, the wider Black community. And they agreed. And the cover, when I spoke to Black people, I've given many, many talks. I've lost count of how many Black Poppies talks I've given. I've been to Liverpool, I've been to Cardiff, I've been to universities, I've been to pensioners' centres, I've been to local libraries, I've been to schools. It's been an extraordinary experience since this book was published. And I made a point of saying to Black people that came to my talks, what attracted you to this book? What drew you to it? And they said the title and the image of the Black sailor and the Black soldier on the first edition in 2014. And the book just kept selling. It hasn't made me a vast amount of money. It's not about that. There's not going to be a lot of money to be made from writing books for a small publishing house. But I'm glad I've stuck with the History Press because they've been tremendously supportive of all my ideas, whereas other publishers have been, some of the bigger publishers are just not engaged with this kind of history. So Black Poppies was published, did very well, was completely ignored during the centenary period, 2014 to 2018, ignored by the BBC, ignored by the newspapers, the media, but the community spread the word and sold it. And so I can't give you all the anecdotes, but I get recognized in the street by Black people who come up to me and say, oh, you're the guy that wrote Black Poppies. They just know about this book and they know about me, and it's been absolutely wonderful. Although it's not about me, it's about the people in my book. I'm just going to tell you very briefly, we don't know the identity of the Black sailor, but the Black soldier. The Black sailor was Marcus Bailey, who was born in Barbados and received his seaman's certificate in 1912. 4 years later, Marcus joined the crew of the Royal Naval vessel HMS Chester as an able seaman. He was serving on the ship when it was hit by 17 shells during the Battle of Jutland. He survived, but continued to serve in the Merchant Navy after the war. And what was lovely about putting Marcus into the book was that I'd already met back in 1991, his daughter Lillian Barda, who was born in Liverpool in 1918 and served with the WAFs, the Women's Air Force, in the Second World War. So she carried on the tradition in her family. Her father served in the First World War. She served in the Second World War, as did her brother James, who served in the Merchant Navy in the Second World War, but was killed in action in 1942. But he is remembered with honour on the Tower Hill Memorial near the Tower of London. I visited that some years ago after I did the book. And in 2019, the History Press came back to me and said, do you have more information? And of course, during this centenary period, more and more people were sending me stories of Black servicemen in the First World War, photographs. And I said, yes, I have acquired quite a lot more information. So they said, would you be interested in doing a second version, the same book, but revised and updated to include more stories? So this time it had a different cover. This is the 2019 edition, which is still in print. Some of the stories from the first edition are in there, but there are some new stories that I'll mention one or two later on. And in both versions of the book, of course, I couldn't ignore Walter Tull. And Walter Tull is probably the best known Black British soldier and the most celebrated Black British soldier of the First World War. Was born in Folkestone in Kent in 1888, became a footballer, played for Tottenham Spurs. And in 1914, he volunteered for the British Army and was enlisted in one of the divisions of the Middlesex Regiment that was made up of footballers. He was commissioned as an officer in 1917, but was killed in no man's land on the 25th of March, 1918, during the Second Battle of the Somme. Now, one of the important things to know is that when we, unlike America, we did not segregate Black soldiers and white soldiers in the armed services in the First or the Second World War. There is a misconception that because the African-American story is so dominant in our school history lessons, which is a pity because the two histories have similarities, but are also very different, we need to make sure that young people understand that Britain wasn't perfect. Britain colonized, Britain had an empire, but the British Army, for all their faults and racism, of course, racist attitudes did exist, the British Army was imperfect, but they did integrate some regiments, and Walter Tull did become an officer. And one of the things I've learned by doing this work is that in history, in British history, not all white people were racist. Not all Black people saw themselves as victims. And one of the examples I give is when Walter Tull was shot, fatally shot on the battlefields at the Second Battle of the Somme in 1918, 3 white men from his regiment tried to retrieve his body under fire. So the Germans are shelling and firing at these men as they tried to save their officers, retrieve his body, but they couldn't get to him. They would have been killed, but they did try. And it shows you the respect and the love they had for Walter. And so I was intrigued to discover in isolated cases that it wasn't a straightforward story of racist attitudes, that in fact some Black men did integrate into white regiments. This is a photograph. I don't know the identity of these men, but if you look carefully, there's a Black soldier with 3 white comrades on the front line. If you look very carefully at the photograph, I know it's difficult on camera, they're all, sorry, there's the Black soldier because it's back to front as I'm looking at it. They're all tired, they're exhausted, they've clearly been in battle. Their clothes, their uniforms are battered and covered in mud, but they're together, they're comrades in arms. And there are several photographs that come to light which bear out that it wasn't all negative. There were some positive stories as well. And there's another photograph I used in the book, the story that we do know a little bit about, Harold Brown, here with one of his white comrades. And Harold Brown was born in the East End of London and served as a Tommy, which is a slang term for infantryman, an ordinary soldier in the First World War. He was a private with the Royal West Surrey Regiment. In his bravery was recognised with 2 certificates of gallantry, and in 1918 the award of the Military Medal. And all these things, the certificates of gallantry and the Military Medal and a few photographs, found their way into the Imperial War Museum. Thank goodness that something survived. He was demobbed in 1919 and then worked as a sailor and then as a docker in the Albert Docks, Royal Albert Docks in London's East End, until he died in 1955. But we know very little else about Harold, but it's, you know, we're glad that something survived. And there's also, in the new version of Black Poppies, not the first version, I uncovered the story of George Arthur Roberts from Trinidad, who not only served in the First World War in the Middlesex Regiment and at the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Ypres, he was wounded. He was brave in these battles and again integrated into the British regiments. In the Second World War, he settled in London, in my part of London, South London, in 1920 after he was left the army after the First World War, and became a fireman. He was too old for active service in the Second World War, but joined the Fire Brigade, the London Fire Brigade, in 1939 and served as a very brave firefighter all through the Second World War, including the London Blitz. His portrait was painted by a famous war artist called Norman Heppel in 1941. And you may recognize him from the advertising on television that's still ongoing for the ancestry.co.uk website. You see him as a firefighter in the Second World War, and his great-granddaughter Samantha Harding is talking about him on the advertisement. I was responsible for nominating him for a Southwark Borough, London Borough Southwark Heritage Blue Plaque, which he received. It's now displayed on the side of his home in Camberwell in southeast London. And that was an honour to be part of. King George V wanted to show the world a united empire in wartime. So in October 1915, the British West Indies Regiment was established as a separate black unit within the British Army. What the British Army discovered was that so many men from the Caribbean wanted to join up, they couldn't accommodate them. All of them in British regiments. So they created the British West Indies Regiment as a separate black unit within the British Army. Recruits came from Guyana and many Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Barbados. By the war's end in November 1918, the regiment had registered over 15,000 men. 16 soldiers from the regiment were decorated for their bravery, but 185 lost their lives and 697 were wounded. Now, Seaford Cemetery in Sussex is the final resting place of 19 soldiers of the British West Indies Regiment. They came from as far afield as Jamaica and St. Lucia and British Honduras and Barbados. And they discovered that when they arrived in Britain at Seaford Camp, Army Camp on the coast, during the winter of 1915, they weren't treated very well. The British Army scandalously put them in huts. They didn't have proper heating, they didn't have proper clothing. They caught measles, they caught influenza. They became ill because they were used to a warmer climate in the Caribbean, and they died. But 19 of them sadly died, never made it to the front line, France and Belgium. But they do have Commonwealth war graves that you can now visit in Seaford Cemetery, and Jack Bueller from commemorated them with a plaque, one of his plaques a few years ago, the British West Indies Regiment in Seaford, which you can now see there. And I think probably the most heartbreaking story that I uncovered when I was originally writing Black Poppies back in 2014 was the story of Private Herbert Morris. You can't see the picture very well, I'm afraid, but this is a picture of the grave of Private Herbert Morris, a heartbreaking story. That grave, Commonwealth War grave, is in Poppering New Military Cemetery in Belgium, which is the final resting place of the 17-year-old Jamaican private, Private Herbert Morris of the British West Indies Regiment. In 1917, Private Morris was executed for desertion, but in 2006, his case was reconsidered and he was pardoned along with 300 other soldiers who were executed for desertion and other offences during the First World War. Now, what happened was I discovered his papers, the papers relating to his court-martial in the National Archives. I accessed them, they copied them for me, and I've highlighted some of it in my book. It's a heartbreaking story because Herbert was just 16 years old when he was traumatized. He was a shell stacker on the front line, which was a very dangerous, risky job to do, stacking the shells for the gunners that were bombing the Germans on the battlefield. The Germans were bombing the British, back across the front line, dropping shells that were exploding, the guns were booming. Herbert, 16 years old from Jamaica, was traumatized. So he absconded, he ran away, and he was caught and brought back. He wasn't medically examined. He was made to go back to shell stacking, was traumatized again, ran away again, was caught, brought back and court-martialed and executed for desertion just after his 17th birthday. It's a heartbreaking story. But it just shows you the bravery of the young Herbert from Jamaica who wanted to join up and take part in the war, but came to a sad end. I'm unable to read the questions. They are on the screen, but it's difficult to do the talk and follow the questions. But I did notice one question, very important. I'm glad for the prompt. Why did men from the colonies, as they were known then, from Africa, the Caribbean, join up? Very important question. They joined up for very similar reasons. They joined up for the Second World War. They joined up because they wanted to prove themselves. Some of them wanted to prove themselves on the battlefield, that they were as good as the white man. Don't forget, they're coming from a repressed colony where their lives they're exploited. Some of them came for adventure, to get away from the colony and have an adventure. Some of them came because they wanted to help the mother country. The recruitment drives in the Caribbean and Africa were very strong. And some of them came, to be fair, for political reasons. Marcus Garvey, who later became a very forthright and respected Jamaican leader of the Black community internationally, in 1914 encouraged Jamaicans to join up and support the war effort, because he said that if you can show that you're equal to the white man, then we may be able to persuade them and strengthen our argument for independence. Well, that didn't happen until long after the Second World War. So there was a long wait for that to happen, but it was all building towards that post-Second World War decolonization, the independence of Jamaica, of Nigeria, and so on. But the seeds were sown in the First World War particularly. Moving on, somebody did also, I noticed a question early on, I may have already answered it. Yes, I have written a book on the Second World War. So I've written a book on the First World War and the Second World War, Under Fire. Sorry, another book plug, but somebody did ask a question. If I miss any questions, we can come back to them at the end. Maybe Kate can help me with that. Royal Flying Corps. Now, before we had the Royal Air Force, the RAF, we had the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War. Jamaica's Sergeant William Robinson Clark became a pioneer of Britain's Royal Flying Corps. He was one of the few Black men to serve as a pilot in the First World War. And in 1917, he was wounded during combat with 5 German pilots. Now, going back to what I said earlier about first-hand testimony being paramount in my work, William Robinson Clark would send letters back home to Jamaica, which were published in the Jamaican Gleaner, the popular Jamaican newspaper. So it was easy through the website of the Jamaican Gleaner and their archive to access some of these letters and have his first-hand testimony of what it was like to be a pilot in the First World War in combat with German fighters. But he lived to a good age. He died in 1982, but was never mentioned until the RAF Museum in Hendon discovered him and discovered photographs of him and his World War I service and began to reclaim him. So like Walter Tull, he was a lost figure because traditional history books about the First World War and the Second World War, let's face it, traditional history, I'm not a traditional historian, I'm not an academic, I'm pleased to say, would miss these stories out, would not consider them important. Now, Black Poppies does include, as I said to you at the beginning, the wider Black community. So I was able to include Black women, Black children in both volumes. There isn't time to go into any detail about those stories, but I do want to mention one of my favorites, women from that period, Mabel Mercer. You can see Mabel Mercer in the center of this photograph. Now, Mabel Mercer was born in Burton-on-Trent in Staffordshire in 1900. She was mixed race. Her father was Black. She didn't know who he was. He wasn't identified on her birth certificate. Her mother was a white bohemian, an old-fashioned word for a woman who didn't stay at home, wanted to go off and have adventures. So she left Mabel in the care of her white grandmother in North Wales, and the North Wales grandmother then sent her to a convent school in Manchester. And Mabel, as a child, a mixed race child, growing up in North Wales and Manchester in the convent school, never met any other Black people. So she later said that she only started to meet, there were no, like my Aunt Esther discovered when she left school in 1926, when Mabel left school in 1914, just as the war's about to break out, the really only job opportunities available to working class mixed race girls or young Black women were going on the stage, as Mabel did, or working as a seamstress, as my Aunt Esther did. in Fulham. And Mabel went on the stage as a chorus girl. And there were many African-American entertainers who were already here in the Edwardian era and didn't go back to America. They stayed here and toured throughout the First World War in Black shows, or shows with all Black casts, singing, entertaining the troops, the British public in musicals. This is the days before we had television and radio. So music hall theatres were the staple for entertainment, for live entertainment. And Mabel then began to meet many and befriend many African Americans during that World War I period. She later wrote an article, or was interviewed in an American magazine called Stereo Review in 1975, and I managed to find a copy on eBay. And to my joy, she talked in detail about this whole World War I period in the music halls. And just to finish off Mabel's amazing story, she became, like many young Black British women, an adventurous, and African-American women, like, you know, some of you may know the story of Josephine Baker. Well, Mabel Mercer is not as famous as Josephine Baker, but she should be. So Staffordshire-born Mabel Mercer left England in the 1920s and began singing in cabarets in Paris. She became a big cabaret star in Paris in the 1930s. When the Germans began to advance across Europe and occupy France, she had to get out. She couldn't stay in Paris during the war. It would not have been safe. But instead of coming back to London or England, she went to New York and became, during the Second World War, Mabel became one of America's foremost, most famous cabaret stars, singing in very swanky, elite sort of cabaret places in New York. In later years, she carried on doing this right into the 1980s when she was quite elderly. And among those she influenced were Barbra Streisand, the young Barbra Streisand, and also the young Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra is on record as saying that when he was coming up as a singer during the Second World War, he would go and listen to Mabel Mercer. Her English phrasing was what they aspired to, these Americans. And Frank Sinatra said he learned more about a lyric from Mabel Mercer than he learned from anyone else. So she was a tremendous influence on a whole generation of younger singers in America. And so she finally took American citizenship and was then given the American Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is a tremendous honor, a couple of years before she passed away in 1984. But she's not that well known in this country, which is a shame because she is a Brit, even though she took American citizenship. Now, coming to the end of the talk, I want to touch upon another chapter in the book, which deals with the 1919 race riots. That they're called the race riots, but they were actually anti-Black attacks on the Black community and Black citizens up and down the country, but particularly in the Black communities that were already established before the First World War in Liverpool and Cardiff in the East End of London. In 1919, African and Caribbean ex-servicemen and their families, because some of them had married white English women and had mixed-race children, and were living mainly in the seaports of Britain, the United Kingdom, but they came under attack in some cities from gangs of white ex-servicemen, because some of the returning white soldiers and ex-servicemen were returning to a country after the First World War that was not a home fit for heroes. They'd served in the First World War, they'd sacrificed their friends, their brothers, sacrificed their lives, and they were disillusioned, and they did a terrible thing. They scapegoated Britain's Black community and they attacked them. And one of the victims was Charles Wootton in Liverpool. He was a sailor from Bermuda, originally from Bermuda, but he was a sailor who had served the British Navy during the First World War. And in Liverpool, he was murdered by angry rioters who chased him into the Queen's Dock, where he drowned. It was in many respects a lynching like they had in America. Only in this case, he wasn't hung, he was chased into the docks, Liverpool docks, and drowned. I'll just repeat that. He was chased by angry rioters from his home in Liverpool, jumped into the Queen's Dock in Toxteth Park to escape them, where he drowned. Now, I accessed a copy of the police report, which states that whilst attempting to take Wootton out of the dock gates under arrest, they wanted to arrest him so they could put him in prison to save him from the rioters, but they couldn't get to him because the crowd surged forward, overwhelming the police constables, knocking them to the ground. The constables fought desperately to protect him. Wootton was dragged off by the crowd, beaten and weighed down by anchor chain and thrown into the dock where he drowned. After this, the police employed heavy tactics with the rioters, baton and mounted police charges, which dispersed the crowd and therefore prevented further murders of this kind. Wootton's body was later recovered from the docks. He was murdered, Charles Wootton was murdered on June the 5th, 1919, and at the inquest into his death, the coroner for Liverpool decreed that the cause of his death was indeed drowning, but added quotes, and this is actually on his death certificate, which I also accessed, how he got into the water, the evidence is not sufficient to show. Or didn't they read the police report? It's quite clear in the police report what the rioters did to Charles Wootton. So it was a cover-up that Liverpool's Black community has never to this date forgotten or forgiven. And Wootton's murder was followed by another disgraceful episode, which was highlighted in Peter Fryer's famous book and groundbreaking book, Staying Power, published in 1984. He said that for the entire Black community in Britain, the final straw came a month after the riots, when it was decided not to allow any Black troops to take part in London's victory celebrations, the much trumpeted Peace March on July the 19th, 1919. I mean, you couldn't get a bigger insult than that. The ultimate sacrifices of Black merchant seamen and soldiers during the First World War, the murder of Charles Wootton and the anti-Black riots in British cities during 1919 remained in the consciousness of an entire generation of Black Britons and Black people in the former colonies. Thereafter, they and their descendants knew what their fate would be if they did not fight for equality and justice. So the Black community in Britain in 1919 did stand firm. They did fight back. They didn't just lay down and die. They fought back. They said, this is our country and we fought in your war. We deserve to be part of this country. And as we now know, there had been generations of Black people in Britain, particularly in Cardiff and Liverpool, going right back to the Victorian era. I know we can go back even further, but I'm talking about the sort of more contemporary history. And just a few weeks after the war had ended, still in 1918, it was addressed by John Archer, the former mayor of Battersea. There's a picture of him here. He was born in Liverpool, he was mixed race, and in 1913 became the mayor of Battersea in London, which was quite a breakthrough at that time, just before the First World War. And he was the first president of an organization that was formed at the end of the First World War called the African Progress Unit. And it wasn't made up just of Africans, it was made up of any person of African descent, including John. And he made the following speech, which I think resonates very much today, 100 years later. He said, our compatriots from Africa, America, and the West Indies have been fighting on the fields of France and Flanders against a foreign foe. The people of this country are sadly ignorant with reference to the darker races. If we are good enough to be brought to fight the wars of this country, we are good enough to receive the benefits of this country. And that was John Archer in 1918. And that's pretty much how I end the book, stating that although we now acknowledge Windrush, 1948, as the beginning of the modern Black community in Britain. I argued back in 2014 with the first edition of Black Poppies, and I argue it again in the more recent edition, that really we should be looking at 1919, when the Black community in Britain, albeit in smaller numbers than there were in post-war Britain, stood firm and fought for their place in this country and for their children's place in this country. I'll end there just on a final note, just to say there is some wonderful news. The History Press have just commissioned me to write a children's version of Black Poppies, because one of the things that breaks my heart is that in schools, particularly primary schools, but also in our academies, they are still teaching young people in this country about African Americans. I know this because teachers come to me, parents of young children come to me and say to me, they're still teaching our children about Dr. Martin Luther King and African American civil rights. It's not to be critical of those choices, because they are, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King is a great figurehead and a great leader. But we can match those stories with stories from Black British history and British history, and we're not doing it. Schools are not doing it. And one of the reasons they're not doing it is there aren't enough Black British history books. Although there has been a shift in a change in the landscape of Black publishing in this country, more Black writers are being commissioned. It's very difficult, apart from David Olusoga, who's done a children's version of Black and British, his huge book. There's still a lack of books, particularly for primary school children, on this subject. So there's lots of Black novelists and poets being commissioned, which is great, and books, biographies and autobiographies, but history is still being overlooked. So I'm hoping that my children's version of Black Poppies, which will be, fingers crossed, published next year, will help some way to fill that gap. So hopefully you'll see it on your Brent Library bookshelves next week. Thank you. I'll end there and take some questions.